Margaret Kowalski lifted the empty suitcase with both hands and grunted loud enough for the whole cul-de-sac to hear. The case weighed nothing. She'd made sure of that, had carried it twice around the kitchen at 6 in the morning, practicing the particular hitch of someone managing 40 pounds of folded clothes and packed toiletries and the accumulated weight of a 2-week vacation. It had to look right. It had to feel right to whoever was watching, and someone was always watching on Sycamore Court. Across the street, the curtain in Evelyn Marsh's front window moved exactly the way it always moved. When something of note happened outside, a slow, almost imperceptible shift to the left, the fabric settling back into stillness, a half-second too late. Evelyn was 68 years old and had retired from the public school library system 9 years ago, and as far as Marge had ever been able to tell, she spent a substantial portion of every day positioned behind that curtain with a cup of tea and the studied patience of someone who considered observation a legitimate hobby. Under ordinary circumstances, Marge found it mildly irritating. This morning, she was counting on it. "Get the blue one too, Dennis," she called toward the front door, pitching her voice to Carrie. "And don't forget your swim trunks." Dennis appeared in the doorway, holding the second empty suitcase with the expression of a man participating in something he still wasn't entirely sure about. He was 73 years old, wide through the shoulders, in a way that decades hadn't fully diminished with the particular stillness of someone who had learned long ago that most situations resolved themselves if you waited long enough, and only required action if they didn't. His left knee had been rebuilt twice and would probably need a third visit sometime in the next few years. He'd been managing the discomfort so long that Marge sometimes forgot it existed until she noticed the way he favored his right side on cold mornings. He descended the porch steps with the careful deliberateness of a man transporting something valuable, which was reasonable performance given that the suitcase was empty. And the most strenuous thing he'd done this morning was pour coffee. From the end of the driveway, Marge could see Ray Muldoon out on the sidewalk in front of his house, 3 properties down, dragging his recycling bin to the curb in the unhurried way of someone not planning to be anywhere before noon. Ray was 67, retired from 22 years with the county highway department, and spent most mornings in his yard doing the moderate, purposeful maintenance of a man who had traded professional usefulness for the domestic kind. He didn't look up as they loaded the trunk. Marge rolled her window down as Dennis backed the Taurus out of the driveway. The air smelled of dry leaves and the first real cold of November, the kind that settled into the back of your throat and reminded you that the year was almost over. 2 weeks in Sarasota. She said it toward the general vicinity of the Hendersons' front porch, which was empty, but it didn't matter. On this street, empty porches had ears. "Doctor said Dennis needs the sun." Ray waved without looking up. The curtain at Evelyn's window had gone still. Dennis honked once at nobody in particular. And then they were moving down Sycamore Court at the careful speed of people in no rush to catch a flight, because there was no flight. And 4 blocks later, Dennis pulled the Ford Taurus into the parking lot of the Comfort Lodge on Birch Street, a single-story motel sandwiched between a tire shop and a sandwich place that had cycled through 3 different names in 2 years and currently advertised a lunch special on a hand-lettered sign that needed replacing. Dennis had paid for the room the day before cash using the name from a period of his life that preceded Marge by several years and a war by none. Room 112 was on the ground floor at the far end of the building, away from the office, with a direct view of the parking lot, and a door that locked from the inside with a deadbolt that felt solid when you tested it. The carpet was a color that existed primarily to hide damage. The 2 queen beds had the specific firmness of furniture that had absorbed a great deal of time without being replaced. The bathroom had a sliding door that didn't quite close all the way. Dennis set the empty suitcases in the corner near the window. He sat on the edge of the bed closest to the door and looked at his hands, then at the room, then at Marge, who was already on her knees beside the second queen, pulling the real luggage from her oversized shoulder bag. Not clothes, not toiletries, but 2 laptops, a bundle of charging cables organized with the neatness of someone who had spent decades making sense of disorder, a battery backup, a portable Wi-Fi hotspot she'd purchased at an electronics store using her granddaughter's old student ID, and a notebook with a dark blue cover that was nearly full. She'd started the notebook in August. It was the third one since the previous October, when she'd first begun writing things down in the particular way she'd written things down for 34 years at Harman and Briggs Plumbing Supply, not as a journal, not as speculation, but as a ledger. Dates in the left margin, observations in the center, questions on the right. The questions were the important part. The questions were where the work happened. She'd been a bookkeeper most of her professional life, which was not the same thing as an accountant in the way that people sometimes assumed when she explained what she'd done for a living. An accountant built structures. A bookkeeper maintained them, which required a different kind of attention. The patience to sit with a column of figures and wait for the one that didn't belong. The willingness to resist the easy explanation when the numbers were almost right but not quite. Almost right was the thing that got organizations into trouble. Almost right was where the lies lived. She'd found two of them at Harman and Briggs over the years. The first was a purchasing manager who had been billing the company for materials delivered to a storage unit he rented under his wife's maiden name. The second was a vendor relationship that had been running a 10% markup through a shell account for 4 years before Marge noticed that the invoicing cycle was slightly off from every other supplier in the system. Not wrong exactly, just slightly off in a way that made no operational sense unless someone had designed it that way. The purchasing manager had cried when she brought it to the owner. The vendor had disputed the finding for 6 months before settling. The owner had kept Marge for the rest of her career and given a speech at her retirement party that included the sentence, "This woman found 2 different ways this company was being stolen from, and both times she found it because she noticed something was almost right." She had carried that discipline into retirement the way some people carry their professional manner into the grocery store, not as a performance but as an orientation, a default way of processing the world. Numbers, patterns, things that didn't add up. When something was off, she felt it the way you feel a draft in a sealed room. Not dramatically, not with alarm, just with the quiet, certain knowledge that something somewhere wasn't closed properly. The first thing she'd felt that way about was the cars. It had started around this time last year, in the weeks after the leaves came down, and the street settled into its November configuration. Fewer people outside houses buttoned up the particular privacy that cold weather provided. She'd been up early one morning, the way she was always up early now, that retirement had removed the artificial boundary between sleeping hours and waking ones. And she'd been at the kitchen window with her coffee when she saw a dark sedan parked at the end of the cul-de-sac with its engine running and its headlights off. It sat there for about 12 minutes. Then it pulled away. She mentioned it to Dennis, who said it was probably someone waiting for a ride share. She mentioned it to Ray Muldoon when she ran into him getting his mail, and he shrugged and said he hadn't noticed anything. She mentioned it to Evelyn Marsh one afternoon when Evelyn came over with a plate of cookies she'd made for a church function and had extras from. And Evelyn changed the subject with a speed and fluency that Marge noticed but didn't pursue because changing the subject was Evelyn's social reflex for anything she found uncomfortable, and there was no obvious reason to read more into it than that. But the cars kept coming. Different cars, never the same. Make or model 2 nights in a row, but always in the same window. Always between 1 and 4 in the morning, always with their headlights off. She started writing them down in October. The date, the approximate time, the color and rough make of the vehicle, the license plate, when the street light caught it at the right angle. By December, she had 14 entries. By February, she had 26. By spring, she had a pattern. The pattern was always near the end of the cul-de-sac where the Neville house sat at the curve or near the vacant lot beside it. Always engine running, never door opening. Always gone within 15 minutes. Always between Tuesday and Saturday, never Sunday or Monday. She didn't know what to do with that last observation. except write it down and underline it, which was what she did with observations she didn't yet understand. The Neville house had belonged to Pete and Sandra Neville for as long as the Kowalskis had lived on Sycamore Court. They were pleasant people, the Nevilles, the kind of neighbors who brought your newspaper to the door if it rained and remembered your kids' names. Pete had lent them his truck 3 times over the years. Sandra had brought a casserole when Marge's mother died, and a decent one, not the kind assembled from canned soup and good intentions. They'd moved to Arizona in June following their daughter the way people did when grandchildren arrived, and retirement made geography negotiable. Their son Craig had taken over the house. Marge had met Craig Neville twice, both times briefly. He was 41, divorced, with the slightly distracted quality of someone managing more logistics than he had bandwidth for. He told her and Dennis at separate occasions that he was renting the house out while he figured out what to do with it longer term, which was a reasonable thing to do with an inherited property. Marge had no particular reason to doubt this, except there was no rental listing. She'd checked. Not on any of the platforms she could find, not through any of the 3 property management companies that served this part of Ohio. The house was not listed for rent anywhere she could locate, which didn't mean it wasn't rented. Private arrangements existed, but it was a small thing that sat sideways in her mind the way small things did. The lights were another small thing. The pattern of lights in the Neville house after Craig took possession was wrong in a way she couldn't immediately articulate, but felt with the same certainty she felt a miscategorized expense. Rooms that should have been bedrooms, the ones with windows facing the street on the 2nd floor, were consistently dark. A room she was fairly sure functioned as a back storage area lit up regularly between midnight and 3 in the morning. Not warm light, not television blue, but the particular cold white of work lighting, of something being examined or processed or organized. She told Dennis about the lights in April. He'd said it could be anything. Insomnia, a night shift worker, a tenant with unconventional hours. All of which was true. She'd written it down anyway. The thing with the gate happened in September. Dennis had fixed the back gate latch that summer, the same latch that had been sticking since spring. He'd replaced the hardware in the last week of August, and she tested it herself, smooth secure. In early October, she went out to bring in the garden hose and found the latch hanging loose again at an angle that was wrong for wear and consistent with force. The hardware wasn't broken, just bent as if something had been pushed against it from the outside with enough pressure to deform the mechanism. She stood there and looked at it for a while, then went inside and added it to the notebook. The cigarette butt appeared on the back deck 3 days later. A single cigarette butt in the center of the deck near the table where she and Dennis had their morning coffee from May through October. Neither of them smoked. None of the neighbors she knew smoked. She photographed it with her phone before she disposed of it, and she added the photograph to the folder she'd started on her laptop around the same time as the notebook. The scratches on the back door lock were the last thing before she ordered the cameras. Dennis had resisted the cameras in the particular way he resisted anything involving new technology, which was with principled stubbornness dressed up as philosophy. They'd lived here 31 years without cameras. Good people didn't surveil their own property. Installing cameras meant becoming the kind of people who needed cameras, and he didn't want to be those people. Marge listened to all of this with the patience she'd developed over 47 years of marriage. And then she said, "Those people still have their garden hoses where they left them." He grumbled for another day, and then said nothing when the package arrived. She installed them herself following a video tutorial created by someone who appeared to be approximately 12 years old and explained each step with the methodical clarity of someone who'd never met an adult who found technology difficult. 4 cameras wireless backed up automatically to cloud storage with motion activation and night vision capable of reading a license plate from 40 feet. She mounted them in locations that made them functionally invisible, the one on the front porch disguised inside a birdhouse she'd bought at a craft store and painted to match the trim, the one at the side gate concealed within a fake lantern, the backyard camera set into a decorative bracket on the fence post. The fourth camera she positioned under the eave of the garage, angled to take in the street, the widest shot, the one that would catch movement on the road and at the edges of the neighboring properties. For 2 weeks, the cameras recorded exactly what you'd expect of a quiet residential street in Ohio in late October. Raccoons at odd hours, the mail carrier cutting across the lawn on her faster route, a deer that came through 2 nights running and stood in the backyard long enough to be almost beautiful. She watched the footage every morning with the same methodical patience she'd applied to everything else, and she found nothing that required the patience. On the night of October 14th at 2:22 in the morning, the backyard camera activated on motion. She'd been asleep. The alert on her phone woke her, and she was sitting up and reaching for the laptop before she was fully conscious of having decided to do so. The screen showed the green-tinted image of a figure moving along the side of the house, not moving tentatively, not moving like someone who'd wandered onto the property by accident, moving with the deliberate, unhurried confidence of someone who had been here before and knew exactly where the house's blind spots were and which path got you to the back gate without crossing the sight lines from the upstairs windows. She watched the figure reach the back gate. They didn't hesitate, didn't try the latch from the outside the way a stranger would. Instead, they reached over the top of the gate and manipulated the latch mechanism from the inside where the hardware sat, where you couldn't reach it unless you knew it was there or had been told where to look. The gate swung open. The figure came through it and into the backyard. She watched them for 11 minutes. They examined the back door, testing the frame, running a hand along the lock in a way that wasn't casual. They went to both rear windows and looked not at the glass, but at the frames and the mounting of the latches, the way a person looked at something they were assessing for a specific purpose. They went to the junction box on the exterior of the house near the back corner, the one that controlled the outdoor lighting circuit, and spent about 90 seconds there. Then they left the same way they'd come, the gate closing behind them, as quietly as it had opened. Marge watched the footage 7 times before she got out of bed. Dennis looked at it in the morning and said it could be a burglar scouting the property, which she understood was his way of proposing the most ordinary explanation available. She pointed out that the figure had spent 11 minutes looking at the house and had not attempted to enter it, had not taken anything from the yard, and had specifically gone to the junction box. She pointed out the way they'd worked the inside latch. Dennis didn't say anything for a while. Then he said the words she'd been waiting to hear. Go back further. She went back further. The cloud storage had everything from the moment she'd turned the cameras on. She found 2 more visits, one on the 8th of October, one on the 29th of September. Same figure, same point of entry, same route through the yard, same approximate duration of 11 to 14 minutes. Nothing taken either time. Just looking, just learning. She brought the footage to the police station on a Tuesday morning. The officer who came out to talk to her was named Brant, young enough that she found herself calculating whether he'd been born before or after she and Dennis bought the house on Sycamore Court. He watched approximately 30 seconds of the footage on her phone and told her it was probably a neighbor's kid checking on a lost pet. He gave her a pamphlet about neighborhood watch programs and a phone number for non-emergency reporting and thanked her for coming in. She drove home and sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open and thought for a long time about what someone repeatedly visiting her property without taking anything was actually doing. A burglar scouted a property to assess its value and its vulnerabilities for the purpose of removing something from it. Someone who visited 3 times over 2 weeks and took nothing wasn't scouting for a burglary. They were scouting for something else, something where the location of the house mattered, where what could be seen from the house mattered, where knowing the layout and the sight lines and the exterior electrical access was preparation for a different kind of operation entirely. You didn't map a house 3 times if you wanted to rob it. You mapped it if you needed to know what it could see. She didn't say this to Dennis that night. She sat across from him at the kitchen table and showed him the 2 older clips she'd found. And then she said the thing that had been building since August, the sentence she'd been writing around in the notebook without quite writing it directly. I think something is very wrong on this street. And Dennis, who had not once in 47 years of marriage, immediately agreed with one of her suspicions. Without a preliminary round of reasonable alternatives, looked at the screen and then looked at her and said, "I think you're right." That was when they started planning. Not a second police report, not a neighborhood meeting, something quieter. Something that used what she had, which was the particular invisibility of a 71-year-old woman who'd spent her professional life in a back office and her personal life on a quiet street. Nobody looked twice at her. Nobody had ever looked twice at her, and she'd made a certain peace with that fact years ago. But sitting at the kitchen table in October with her notebook and her laptop, she began to understand that invisibility was an asset. It had always been an asset. She just hadn't had occasion to deploy it this way. The plan had a logic that was almost arithmetical in its simplicity. If someone had been assessing their property as a potential obstacle, then staying in the house and watching openly would accomplish nothing, except alerting whoever was doing the assessing that the assessment had failed. But if she and Dennis appeared to be gone publicly convincingly, with witnesses and luggage, and the whole theater of a planned vacation, then whatever had been waiting for them to be absent would proceed, and she would be 4 blocks away with cloud access to 4 cameras and 34 years of practice at finding what didn't add up. She needed the street-facing camera most. From the right angle under the garage, Eve, it could see the Neville house, the Muldoon house, and the entrance to the alley that ran between the 2 properties at the back of the lot line. She had a good sense of what the street looked like when it was sleeping. What she needed to know was what it looked like when it thought no one was home. Dennis's objections came in order of practicality. She addressed each one. The money was manageable. The mattress would survive him. And if something went wrong in their absence, they'd be 4 blocks away with a phone and a car, and whatever they'd managed to document before it happened. She had also been thinking about CN Logistics, LLC, which she'd found 6 days earlier in the county business registry. Craig Neville's company filed in January, 8 months before his parents had even moved out of the house she now suspected was the operating address. A company with no website, no listed employees, no visible clients registered to a P.O. box in the next county. She'd cross-referenced the commercial vehicle registration attached to the LLC against her notebook entries and matched the plate on a white cargo van to an entry from mid-September. A van that had parked 2 houses down from Sycamore Court at 1:40 in the morning and sat there for 9 minutes before driving away. The construction of it looked legitimate at a glance and became less so the deeper you went. She'd seen that pattern before, and she knew what it meant when something was almost right in exactly the right places. The morning of their departure, Marge stood at the bathroom mirror at 6:15 and looked at herself with the particular assessment she reserved for situations that required her to be something specific. 71 years old. Gray hair kept short. The fine lines around her eyes that Dennis called laugh lines. The hands that had processed more invoices and reconciled more accounts than she'd ever stopped to count. She had spent her entire career being systematically underestimated by everyone who looked at her job title instead of her work, and she had never particularly resented it because the underestimation was useful. You could see a great deal more when nobody was watching to see what you saw. She was about to use that, all of it, every year of it. Dennis appeared in the bathroom doorway holding a travel mug she hadn't asked him to make. "Car's warm," he said. She took the mug. They loaded the empty suitcases into the trunk with the careful performance of people with a flight to catch. Dennis locked the front door and jiggled the handle twice the way he always did, the old habit that had nothing to do with actual security and everything to do with the ritual of leaving. And then he came down the porch steps and got in the car. They backed out of the driveway at 8:47. Marge rolled her window down as they passed the Marsh house. 2 weeks in Sarasota, she said to the air to the street to whoever was recording. Doctor said Dennis needs the sun. 4 blocks later, she closed the window. 4 blocks after that, Dennis pulled into the Comfort Lodge parking lot and cut the engine. They walked into room 112 together, and Marge set up the laptops and the hotspot and the battery backup with the focused efficiency of someone who had been planning this moment for weeks. And when the screens came alive and the 4 camera feeds filled the display front porch, backyard, side gate, street view, she pulled a chair close and sat down and looked at the quiet, ordinary morning image of 47 Sycamore Court, Delwood, Ohio. The house she and Dennis had carried their lives into 31 years ago. "Think they bought it?" Dennis asked from behind her. She watched the empty street on the screen. The bare trees, the dry November lawns, the still curtain in Evelyn Marsh's front window. Everything perfectly, deliberately, uselessly normal. We're about to find out. The first 48 hours were exactly what patience looked like before it became something else. Evelyn Marsh collected her mail at 11:15 on day 1, same as always. Ray Muldoon walked his terrier at 7 in the morning and again at 4 in the afternoon. A delivery truck stopped at the Neville house mid-afternoon, left a box on the step without knocking, and pulled away. Marge noted the time and the company logo, and the fact that nobody came to the door for 40 minutes after the truck left, which was either because no one was home or because whoever was inside had no interest in appearing to be home. Day 2 brought a cat and nothing else of significance. The cat crossed the front yard of 47 Sycamore Court at 2 in the afternoon, stopped at the decorative birdhouse mounted on the porch rail, and pressed its nose directly against the camera lens with the unhurried curiosity of a creature that had never been surveilled and didn't intend to start worrying about it now. The image filled the entire screen, fur whiskers, one enormous unblinking eye, and held there for 3 full seconds before the cat lost interest and moved on. Dennis looked at it from across the room. Thrilling. Patience, Marge said, and meant it. And he knew she meant it, which was why he went back to his book without saying anything else. Day 3 arrived at 1:47 in the morning. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand with the particular vibration pattern she'd assigned to motion alerts on the street-facing camera. And she was sitting up and reaching for the laptop before she was fully conscious of having decided to do so. The screen showed a dark sedan parked at the curb in front of the Neville house. No visible plates. The angle was wrong, the light was insufficient, and whoever had parked had chosen the spot with the specific competence of someone who understood where the streetlight coverage ended. Engine running, headlights off, the car sat for 9 minutes without anything happening, which on a residential street at 2 in the morning was itself a category of event. Then the passenger door opened. Same build as the figure from the backyard footage. Same dark clothing, same hooded jacket, same quality of movement. Not cautious, not furtive, but precise. The walk of someone executing a task they'd rehearsed. They went up the Neville driveway, past the front door, without a glance at it, and around the far side of the house, where the camera's sightline ended at the property edge. Dennis had given up pretending to sleep. He stood behind Marge's chair with one hand on the back of it, and she could feel in the pressure of his grip the same controlled attention she recognized from 47 years of watching him process things he hadn't decided how to feel about yet. 4 minutes and 11 seconds later, the figure reappeared at the corner of the house. They were carrying something, a box not large, roughly the dimensions of a desktop computer tower. They loaded it into the trunk with the unhurried efficiency of a person returning library books, and got back in the car, and the sedan pulled away southbound at a speed that would have attracted no attention from anyone watching. Marge opened the notebook and wrote it down. November 5th, 1:47 a.m., dark sedan, no visible plates. One occupant exits, enters Neville property via east side access, exits 4 minutes 11 seconds later, carrying one box medium small, departs southbound. She underlined the word routine and looked at it for a moment before she closed the pen cap. Not because the word was wrong, because it was exactly right. And that was the thing that made the back of her neck cold. Night 4 brought a pickup truck with a covered bed and 2 figures who stayed 23 minutes and came out with 3 boxes between them. Night 5 was a van white cargo configuration. No markings that she recognized from the commercial vehicle registration attached to CN Logistics LLC. The plate matching an entry from her September notebook. Night 6 was another sedan, different make, same pattern. Each vehicle arrived in the same window between 1 and 3 in the morning. Each sent its occupants around the east side of the Neville house. Each departed with cargo. The operation moved with the rhythm of something that had been running long enough to have lost any anxiety about itself. By the morning of day 7, Marge had filled 4 pages of the notebook with vehicle descriptions, timestamps, estimated box counts, and directional departures. Dennis stood beside her at the small table near the window and looked at the spreadsheet she'd built on the second laptop, which organized the same information in columns that could be sorted and cross-referenced. He was quiet long enough that she knew he was doing the arithmetic himself. "Whatever's in those boxes," he finally said. "Somebody wanted us not to see them taking it out." That was the question she'd been sitting with since the first night. The operation at the Neville house was consistent with a distribution point, not manufacturing, not primary storage, but transit. Things arriving and departing on a schedule. The overnight timing suggested awareness of surveillance risk. The consistency of the access route suggested familiarity with the property's layout. And the 3 prior visits to the Kowalski backyard, the careful mapping of sightlines from the back deck and the side windows confirmed that whoever was running this had identified 47 Sycamore Court as an observation risk and had been assessing whether that risk was active. The assessment had concluded that the risk was not active. The Kowalskis were in Sarasota. The operation had accelerated accordingly. Marge went back through Craig Neville's public records on the morning of day 8, with more to look for now, working more systematically. The property transfer was clean and correctly filed. CN Logistics LLC was registered in January, 8 months before the elder Nevilles left for Arizona, which meant Craig had established his company infrastructure before he had the property in anticipation of having it. The registered agent was a service company in Columbus. She ran the van's plate through every public database she could access from a motel room in Ohio and confirmed the registration. It was the kind of construction that looked legitimate at a glance and became less so the deeper you went. The same instinct that had made her look twice at a vendor invoice 17 years ago was making her look twice at CN Logistics now. She was still working through the spreadsheet that afternoon when the thought arrived about Evelyn Marsh. It arrived the way the important thoughts usually did, not as a revelation, but as a small, persistent clarification. She'd been thinking about the street-facing camera, about what else was visible in its frame besides the Neville property. She'd switched all 4 cameras from motion-activated to continuous recording on day 5 because she'd realized the motion alerts were missing activity at the edges of the frame. The continuous recording meant more footage to review, but it also meant she caught things the algorithm would have discarded. She went back through the street-facing footage from the previous 3 nights, watching at 4 times normal speed, looking at the edges of the frame. She found it on night 9 at 12:17 in the morning. The footage showed the detached garage behind the Marsh house, a single-story structure set back from the main building, separated from it by a flagstone path. Evelyn had always described it as storage. The street-facing camera caught it only partially at the far edge of its range, which was why Marge had never paid it particular attention. But at 12:17 that night, a dim light appeared beneath the garage door. Not from a window which had been covered on the inside with dark paper, but from the gap at the floor, a thin, bright line that would have been invisible from the street at any normal hour. Then Evelyn Marsh crossed from the main house to the garage. She moved across her own backyard with the speed and directness that Marge had never seen from her in 26 years of proximity. Not the measured gait of a woman approaching 70, quick, certain, purposeful. She glanced left and right before she reached the garage door, the kind of look that wasn't checking for obstacles, but checking for witnesses. And then she pulled the door open and went inside and pulled it shut behind her. Marge set down her coffee cup without taking the sip she'd been about to take. 14 minutes later, A car arrived, a silver Honda with a dented rear bumper. Older model, parking one house north of the Marsh property rather than directly in front of it. A woman got out somewhere around 40 carrying a duffel bag with both hands, the posture of someone managing weight distributed at the bottom. She didn't approach the front door of the Marsh house. She went around the back and entered the detached garage through the back-facing door. 22 minutes later, she came out the same way. The duffel bag carried now in one hand moved with the looseness of something substantially lighter than when it had arrived. Dennis put his hand on the back of her chair again. She could feel the change in his grip, the tightening that meant he'd arrived at the same place she had. 2 houses, he said. It wasn't a question. 2 houses, she confirmed. And then the geometry of it assembled itself in her mind with the clarity of a balance sheet clicking into reconciliation. The Neville property intake distribution, the nightly removal of cargo. The Marsh garage, something else, something that received visitors with bags and sent them away lighter, which suggested exchange rather than storage. And between them, sitting at the exact midpoint with a back deck that had a direct sightline to the Neville side entrance and side windows that faced the Marsh garage, 47 Sycamore Court. The one property on this block whose position covered both operations simultaneously. The visits to the backyard gate were not random. They were not opportunistic. Someone had looked at the layout of this street and identified the Kowalski house as the single point from which both adjacent operations could be observed, and had sent someone to assess whether the people living there were observant enough to be a problem. The scouting wasn't preparation for a burglary. It was a security audit. Dennis said they should go to the police, and she reminded him about Officer Brandt and the pamphlet, and he said that was before they had more now. And she said what they had was cars parking and people walking, and a woman visiting her own garage at midnight. We don't know what the crime is yet, she said. It matters because if we go in with suspicion and timestamp footage of nothing explicitly illegal, we get another pamphlet. And this time, whoever is running this gets warned that someone is watching. He sat on the edge of the bed and worked his knee with the heel of his hand. The gesture he made when he was thinking through something he didn't want to be thinking through. She understood the impulse. We need a better angle on that garage, she said. The alley between the Muldoon and Neville properties ran behind the houses on the west side of the street, connecting to a service road used by the city for utility access. From the right position in the alley, specifically from the fence post at the back corner, where the Muldoon and Neville lots met, the angle opened up across the narrow gap between the houses and gave a direct view of the Marsh garage rear door and the window that the inside paper didn't fully cover. A small battery-powered camera mounted at that post would give her what the existing cameras couldn't reach. Dennis's objection was immediate and not unreasonable. The alley was almost certainly the access route. She agreed with him, which was why she intended to place the camera during the day as a woman checking on her garden because she'd forgotten to adjust the sprinkler timer before leaving on vacation. Nobody would question it. The entire principle of her invisibility rested on the fact that nobody ever questioned a woman her age doing something domestic and slightly forgetful. She went the next morning. Dennis drove and waited at the corner of Birch and Elm, with the engine idling and his eyes on the rearview mirror. She wore gardening gloves and the wide-brimmed sun hat she kept in the car for summer errands, which looked somewhat eccentric in November, but entirely in character. She carried a dollar store watering can and had the 5th camera, battery-powered, adhesive mount 72 hours of recording time in the pocket of her jacket. The alley was narrower than she remembered, and more cluttered chain-link fence sections on both sides, interspersed with wooden boards, overgrown dead vines. The accumulated debris of things people stored behind their houses because they didn't want them visible from the front. She walked slowly, which was not a performance. The ground was uneven under a thin coat of mud from the previous night's drizzle. She looked at the Neville fence as she passed it, wooden, 6 feet with fresh scratches around the gate latch hardware. Through the gaps between boards, she could see the worn path that ran from the alley gate to the side door of the house. Not a path from occasional use, but a compressed channel of flattened grass and embedded mud that spoke of repeated recent heavy foot traffic. She continued to the rear corner post where the Neville and Muldoon properties met. From here, the gap between the houses opened up, and she could see the Marsh garage rear window side door, the line of the fence separating the property from the alley. She peeled the adhesive backing from the camera mount, pressed it firmly against the post at a height obscured by the dead vine growing across the top rail, and angled the lens toward the garage. The power button produced a single green blink, and then darkness. 72 hours of recording beginning now. She was back in the car in 8 minutes. She pulled off the gardening gloves and looked at her hands, which were trembling with a fine, controlled vibration that had nothing to do with the cold. It was the knowledge that she just placed a camera in an alley being used by people who did not want to be seen, and that if any of them happened to look at the right fence post in the next 72 hours, she and Dennis would become something other than an inconvenience. It was on the drive back that she noticed what she'd missed in the alley. The worn path from the Neville gate. She'd registered it, consciously noted it, moved past it. But there was something adjacent to it that she'd processed without fully examining, a secondary track, fainter visible, mainly because the mud held impressions. It branched off the main path and moved toward a gap in the fence boards where the Neville and Muldoon properties shared a corner marker. And on the other side of that gap was the Muldoon backyard. She didn't say it aloud in the car. She needed to be sure before she said it. That evening, she went back through the footage from the side gate camera, the one covering the narrow passage between the Kowalski house and the Muldoon property, which she'd been reviewing, with the least scrutiny because it had produced nothing beyond raccoons and a delivery driver who'd taken a shortcut. She went back 3 nights, night 7, nothing, night 8, nothing, night 9 at 2:14 in the morning. Movement in the Muldoon backyard, not near the fence line, but deeper in the property near the rear corner of the house, where a basement window sat level with the ground. A figure crouched beside the window, smaller than the figures she'd seen at the Neville house, quicker in their movements with the particular economy of motion of someone who'd done this specific thing many times. They lifted the window. It swung upward on its hinge with the ease of something recently oiled or recently unlocked from the inside, and passed something down to whoever was below. A hand appeared from the darkness beneath, received the transfer, and withdrew. The window came down. The figure straightened and disappeared back toward the alley, moving fast, gone in 90 seconds total. Ray Muldoon had told anyone who asked, including Dennis at the block party 3 summers ago, that he'd converted the basement into a home gym after his doctor told him he needed to get his weight down. He'd been pleased about it in the way people were pleased about investments in their own improvement. Nobody had ever been invited to see it. Marge set the laptop on the bed and sat with her hands in her lap. 3 houses, not 2. 3 houses within 200 feet of each other, all active in the same overnight window, all using the same alley for access, all running with the coordination of something that had a center, a designer person or people above the street level activity who understood the whole picture. And the whole picture included the Kowalski house sitting at the midpoint, its deck and its windows covering the approaches to all 3 as the single most significant vulnerability in that picture. Dennis came out of the bathroom and looked at her face and didn't ask if something was wrong because the answer was already visible. She turned the laptop toward him and played the basement window footage. He watched it twice. Then he stood up and walked to the bathroom, and she heard the tap run cold, and he came back with his face damp and his eyes holding the particular quality she associated with the moments in their marriage when something real had arrived and there was no useful way to make it smaller. "Ray," he said. "Yes," she said. He sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. Ray Muldoon, who had helped him carry roofing material up a ladder in 2009. Ray Muldoon, whose tomatoes came over every August without fail, always more than 2 people could eat always with the generosity of someone who grew things, because giving them away was the point. Ray Muldoon, who had stood at the edge of the Kowalski driveway at Maria's graduation party and told Dennis with complete sincerity that he was proud of them both. Were any of them real? Dennis asked. And it wasn't a rhetorical question. He wanted to know. He was the kind of man who needed the question answered even when the answer was going to cost something. I think Ray was a good neighbor for a long time, she said carefully. And then he became a person in a bad situation who made a choice that was worse than he was. I think both things are true at the same time, and I think that's harder than if he had been pretending from the beginning. She paused. The pretending from the beginning is Evelyn. Dennis was quiet for a long time. Outside, the tire shop had closed for the night and the parking lot was empty. We need more, he said finally. Not just for us. Enough that no one can dismiss it. She nodded. She had the alley camera running. 3 more nights to document what she couldn't yet see to complete the ledger before she took it to someone who couldn't give her a pamphlet. She built the spreadsheet further that evening, adding columns for estimated personnel overlap figures who appeared in footage from more than one location. By 10 that night, she had identified 4 individuals who appeared in footage from both the Neville property and the Marsh Garage approach, 2 who appeared in footage from both the Marsh Garage and the alley behind the Muldoon house, 1 who appeared in all 3 locations, 1 network, 3 nodes, 1 street. Dennis sat beside her and looked at the spreadsheet for a long time. I keep thinking about the tomatoes, he said at last. She took his hand without looking away from the screen. His fingers were thick and the knuckles enlarged from the years and the work, but his grip was steady. It had always been steady. 3 more days, she told him. Then we have enough to take to someone who can't give us a pamphlet. He didn't ask who that would be. He trusted that she'd worked it out because she had worked it out. She'd known since the conversation with Officer Brandt that the police station was not where this was going to end. And she'd been sitting with the answer for 2 weeks, testing it the way she tested figures before she committed them to a final column. On night 10 at 1:53 in the morning, the alley camera captured a figure approach the Marsh Garage from the alley side and enter through the back door, which opened from the inside before they knocked, meaning someone inside had been waiting. The figure was inside for 17 minutes. When they came out, they were carrying something flat and rigid, roughly the size of a laptop sleeve tucked under one arm. She recorded the timestamp and added it to the column and sat back and thought about what moved in flat, rigid shapes at 2 in the morning through residential alleys in Ohio, and she thought about pharmaceuticals and stolen electronics and the cold white light that Craig Neville's storage room threw his second-floor windows. She had 14 days of escalating activity across 3 properties operating on a coordinated schedule, using shared personnel and a shared access route. Whatever this was, it had been here the whole time underneath the tomatoes and the casseroles and the birthday cards running on its own schedule in the hours when the street trusted that everyone was asleep. She picked up her pen and wrote at the top of a clean page in the notebook, 3 houses, 1 network, 1 alley, and then beneath that the question she intended to answer. Who decided we were the problem? She was going to find out. She had 3 more nights. She didn't know yet what the answer was going to cost. The phone buzzed at 2:14 in the morning on the 12th day, and Marge was already reaching for it before the second vibration, the way you reach for something you've been half expecting, even when you'd hoped it wouldn't come. The alert was from the front porch camera, her house. She looked at the small screen, and what she saw made her sit up so fast the blanket fell to the floor, and she was on her feet before she had processed the full image. The figure on the screen was not the same person who had visited the backyard in September and October. Different build, broader through the chest, with the slightly forward-leaning posture of someone who carried weight in their upper body. They were at the front door, and they were pouring something from a container, working in the methodical left-to-right pattern of a person distributing a substance deliberately. And Marge understood what she was watching. Before she understood it, the way you understand a car accident in the half second before it happens. Dennis. Her voice came out at a register she didn't recognize as her own flat and stripped of everything that wasn't necessity. Dennis, wake up. Someone is at the house. He was beside her in the time it takes a person to move from sleeping to standing, when the word someone carries the weight she'd put into it. They watched the screen together. The figure stepped back from the door and reached into a jacket pocket and produced a small bright point of orange light. The flame touched the base of the door frame. The liquid caught immediately, not a gradual warming, but an immediate committed bloom of fire that the night vision camera rendered in shades of white so bright they were almost beautiful, and the door frame began to burn. Dennis had the car keys off the nightstand. Before she had reached for her bag, she picked up both laptops and the notebook. They were across the parking lot and into the car in under a minute, and Dennis was already driving before she'd pulled her door fully shut, accelerating out of the Comfort Lodge lot onto Birch Street, with the focused grimness of a man who had at one point in his life been trained to move toward bad situations rather than away from them. She could smell it 2 blocks from Sycamore Court. The air changed with the particular chemical sharpness of burning polymer and treated wood, the smell that bypassed the analytical parts of the brain and went directly to the oldest ones. Dennis ran the stop sign at Elm without slowing. She didn't say anything. She was watching the sky above the rooflines where an orange pulse pressed upward against the low November clouds, with the ugly regularity of something feeding on itself. 2 fire trucks were already on Sycamore Court when they turned onto it, which meant someone had called it in fast, which meant someone had been awake and watching, which she filed immediately in the part of her mind that processed implications rather than emotions. The street held the specific stillness of a neighborhood, interrupted figures in coats and ropes on the opposite sidewalk porch, lights on down the block. The front of 47 Sycamore Court was burning. Not entirely. The fire department had responded quickly enough that the back half of the structure remained intact, but the porch was gone, reduced to a collapsed tangle of blackened lumber and melted hardware, and the front door was a rectangle of flame being suppressed by 2 hose lines that arced water into the destruction with a sound like continuous tearing. Smoke poured from both front windows in dense rolling waves. Marge did not get out of the car. She sat in the passenger seat with both laptops balanced in her lap and the notebook pressed against her sternum, and she watched her house burn. Dennis had stopped the Taurus in the middle of the road because there was nowhere else to put it, and he sat behind the wheel with his hand still on it, his knuckles white, his jaw working on words that wouldn't come out. The hydrangea beds along the front walk were below the fire line. The garden was untouched. She noted this with the portion of her mind that was still taking inventory. Evelyn Marsh was standing on her front lawn in a quilted robe with her arms crossed and her face turned toward the fire with an expression that contained none of the components Marge would have expected from a person watching a neighbor's house burn. Not horror, not the helpless distress of someone confronting sudden destruction. Something much more composed than that. Something that looked from 40 feet away in the dark like assessment. The fire investigator found them 20 minutes later, parked at the end of the cul-de-sac. Sandra Reyes was compact and steady in the way of people who arrived at bad scenes regularly enough to have made their professional peace with it. She asked the standard questions, and Dennis answered with the cover story. Sarasota, 2 weeks left Saturday morning. No electrical issues, no recent work done on the property. Marge answered nothing, because she was doing arithmetic. The fire had been set at 2:14. She had the timestamp from the camera. The fire department was already on scene when they arrived at approximately 2:31, which meant the call had come in well before their arrival. Who reported it? She asked, interrupting Dennis mid-sentence. Reyes checked her clipboard. Anonymous cell call came in at 2:17. 3 minutes. The fire was set at 2:14, and someone called it in at 2:17. Not the response time of a neighbor, jolted awake by the smell of smoke fumbling for a phone in a dark bedroom. That was the response time of someone who had been watching from a position close enough to see the fire take hold, who had a phone already in hand, who had been waiting for a specific moment to make a specific call. Someone who needed the fire department to arrive before the whole structure was lost, not to save the house, but to ensure the outcome served its purpose, to burn what needed burning and leave the rest. She said nothing to Reyes. She let Dennis finish answering the standard questions and accepted the card with the insurance information and thanked the investigator. By 4 in the morning, the fire was out. The front of the house was a ruin. The porch collapsed, the living room gutted water, and smoke damage extending through most of the first floor. But the back half stood. The kitchen, the upstairs bedrooms, the back deck Dennis had spent 3 summers building intact. The backyard camera was intact. The side gate camera was intact. The street-facing camera under the garage eave was intact. And the footage from all 4 cameras was in the cloud, completely unaffected by the fact that the front of the house it had been recording was currently being assessed by a fire investigator for accelerant patterns. The 5th camera, still mounted on the alley fence post, was still running. They drove back to the Comfort Lodge at 4:15. Marge carried the laptops inside and opened the one connected to the camera system and pulled up the front porch footage. The recording was intact up to the moment the fire reached the camera housing. 2 minutes and 14 seconds of clear footage. She watched it 3 times at regular speed and then frame by frame through the section she hadn't been able to examine clearly on her phone screen. The figure retreating from the door after setting the fire turned slightly, not toward the camera, not in a way that suggested awareness of it, but in the natural rotation of someone pivoting to leave, and the turn brought the left side of their face into the camera's sight line for approximately 1.5 seconds. The image was degraded by heat distortion and the limitations of night vision rendering at that distance, but it resolved into a jawline, an ear, and a section of neck that carried a mark, a patch of lighter skin, roughly the size of a large thumbprint that could be a scar or a birthmark, and was in either case a feature. She saved the frame and enhanced it, and placed it in the documentation folder alongside everything else. This was Dale Pruitt, though she wouldn't know his name until Renata told her. What she knew now was his face. Then she opened the street-facing camera footage from the same timestamp. The wider angle had captured the figure's full arrival. They'd come on foot from the direction of the alley, crossed the Kowalski front yard without hesitation, completed the task in under 2 minutes, and retreated the same way. But as the figure moved back toward the alley, the street camera caught something at the far edge of its frame that the porch camera hadn't been positioned to see. A second person, standing at the mouth of the alley, partially screened by the fence, not moving, watching. This person was not wearing a hood. The camera caught their face in the ambient light from the street lamp, one property over, not sharply, but with enough resolution to establish the basic topography of the features. The position, the posture, the particular way of standing with arms crossed and weight slightly back that Marge had watched from across the street for 26 years. She looked at the image for a long time, long enough that Dennis stopped watching the screen and started watching her. The woman who had brought a pie when her mother died. The woman who remembered the birthdays of every family on the block and sent cards that arrived on the correct day. The retired school librarian who complained about noise past 8 in the evening and kept her porch light off after 9 to signal that she was done with the day. Standing in an alley at 2 in the morning, watching Margaret Kowalski's house burn with the face of someone watching a process conclude. Marge closed the laptop the way she closed a ledger at the end of a fiscal year. With finality, with the satisfaction of someone who had followed every entry to its source and found that the numbers told exactly the story she'd suspected they would tell. "I want to finish what we started," she said, "and then I want to burn their world down the way they burned ours." except I'm going to use paperwork instead of a lighter." Dennis almost smiled. It was a grim shape, more teeth than warmth, but it was real and it was his, and she had been married to it for 47 years. She knew exactly who she was going to call. She had known since Officer Brandt and his pamphlet in the general way that you know where a problem will eventually have to go even before you have enough to take it there. Renata Shaw was 42 years old and had been an assistant district attorney in the county prosecutor's office for 9 years, specializing in financial crime and organized activity. She was Marge's niece by the complicated mathematics of extended family, close enough in lineage to share holidays and distant enough in practice to go nearly a year between conversations. But Renata had once told Marge at a Thanksgiving dinner years ago that she had the analytical instincts of an investigator and had spent her career applying them to plumbing invoices. Marge had remembered it because it was accurate and because the people who saw you accurately were worth remembering. More concretely, she had read Renata's name in the local paper in August, in a piece about a county-level prosecution of a fencing and redistribution network operating through residential properties. She'd noted it and cross-referenced it with what she knew about Renata's specialty, and left it in the part of her mind where useful information waited. This was not luck. This was the practice of a woman who read things carefully and kept track of what mattered. She called at 5 in the morning. Renata picked up on the third ring the voice of someone who answered early calls because their work required it. "Aunt Marge, is everything all right?" "No," Marge said, "but it will be. I need 45 minutes of your time, and I need you to take notes." She talked for 47 minutes. Not the version shaped by fear or exhaustion, the professional version. Dates, timestamps, vehicle descriptions, business registration details, property records, cloud storage addresses with footage that was authenticated and unaltered. A spreadsheet organized with the precision of someone who had spent 34 years making sure the numbers were right before she committed them to the record. Renata did not interrupt once. When Marge finished, the line was quiet for nearly 10 seconds. "Aunt Marge," Renata finally said, "I need you to understand what you've built here, because what you've described is not a suspicion, it's a case file." The organized crime task force in the county had been running a parallel investigation for 4 months. They had identified 2 nodes of a fencing and redistribution network, but could not locate the third. The communications they'd intercepted referenced a residential hub in a cul-de-sac with limited external access points and high operational security. They knew it existed and couldn't find it from the outside. Marge had found it from a motel room 4 blocks away, with 2 laptops and a notebook, and the habit of attention she'd been practicing since before Renata was born. She did not feel triumphant about this. She felt the weight of it, the full accumulated weight of 14 days and 3 houses and a front porch that was currently a pile of ash on the street where she had spent 31 years of her life. "The arson investigation is separate from the task force operation," Renata said. "Different jurisdiction, different charging authority. But the footage you have places an identified individual at the scene of a felony arson at the moment of commission, and places a second identified individual in the alley as a witness present during the act. Cooperation agreements in one proceeding do not automatically extend protection in another." "She watched my house burn, Renata." "I know," Renata said, and the professional insulation dropped out of her voice completely. "I know she did, and the footage that shows it is yours, and it will go where it needs to go." 48 hours later, the task force executed simultaneous warrants on all 3 properties on a Tuesday morning at 7 a.m. Renata called at 6 to make sure Marge heard it from her first. Dennis dressed in a clean shirt buttoned to the collar, which was his way of receiving significant news with the dignity it required. They sat in room 112 with the laptop open and watched the camera feeds show Sycamore Court in the flat gray light of a November morning. Everything surfaced still, nothing yet broken open. In the time Marge had spent waiting, Renata had also shared what the investigation had established about the mechanics of each person's involvement. Craig Neville had been recruited by a larger organization shortly after inheriting the house, his CN Logistics LLC providing the legal scaffolding for what was functionally an intake and distribution operation. Connor Muldoon, Ray's nephew, had brought his uncle into the arrangement by offering to cover the medical bills that had been accumulating since Ray's diagnosis the previous year. A surgery Ray couldn't afford and was too proud to discuss with anyone on the street. Ray had agreed and had been agreeing ever since, and the basement that nobody had been invited to see had been running as a storage facility for 18 months. Marge thought about that for a long time. A man drowning in debt he had never mentioned, offered a rope by someone who knew exactly how to attach conditions to it. She didn't forgive him for the choice he'd made, but she understood the dimensions of the hole he'd been standing in, and understanding it was its own kind of burden. Evelyn Marsh was the piece she sat with longest. What Renata confirmed was what Marge had already largely reconstructed from the footage and the patterns. Evelyn had been the network's intelligence asset on Sycamore Court for more than 2 years. Her position as the street's most dedicated observer, the curtain watcher, the schedule tracker, the woman who always knew who was home and who wasn't, had made her invaluable. She monitored neighbor routines, flagged changes in patterns, and provided the intelligence that kept the operation invisible. Every conversation with Marge about vacation plans or evening walks or when the daughters were visiting had been data collection. Every friendly wave had been surveillance. The pie after the funeral, the birthday cards, 2 years of them layered on top of a second purpose that ran beneath the surface of every interaction like a current you couldn't see, but that was moving everything above it. Marge sat with that knowledge the way you sit with a stone you've been carrying long enough, that you've stopped feeling its weight, and then suddenly feel all of it at once. At 6:51, the first vehicles appeared. 4 dark SUVs moving in the deliberate formation of people who had rehearsed the approach, followed by 2 marked cruisers with their lights off. They split at the midpoint of the street with the precision of a plan that had been workshopped until the timing required no communication. 2 SUVs and a cruiser peeling toward the Neville house, 1 SUV continuing to the Marsh property. The remaining vehicles stopping at the Muldoon house, simultaneously all of it unfolding in the same 15-second window. Marge put her hand over Dennis's at 6:58. Neither of them spoke. At 7 o'clock, exactly 3 sets of fists came down on 3 separate doors, and the sound of it reached the street-facing camera's microphone as a single low percussion, the sound of something ending. The Neville house opened first, a man she didn't recognize in the doorway, and the officers moved past him with the momentum of a process that didn't require his cooperation, but was offering it as a courtesy. The Muldoon house opened second. Ray appeared in his navy robe, the same one he'd worn to get his newspaper for as long as she could remember, and he stood very still while an officer presented the warrant. And then his shoulders dropped, not dramatically, not with collapse, but with the specific incremental deflation of a man releasing something he'd been holding for a long time, and he stepped aside. The Marsh house did not open. Officers knocked twice more and announced themselves, and knocked a third time, and the kitchen light that had been on since before 6 remained on behind the front window. 40 seconds passed. Then the door opened, and Evelyn Marsh came out onto her porch, in her quilted robe, reading glasses pushed up into her hair, a teacup in her hand with the composure of someone who had prepared for this possibility, the same way she had prepared for every contingency she'd been managing for 2 years, quietly in advance, without visible disturbance. She set the teacup on the porch railing, with the careful placement of someone who intended to pick it up again later, folded her hands, and stood while officers moved past her into the house. She did not look toward the end of the cul-de-sac where the Taurus was parked. At 9:15, Craig Neville was escorted to a patrol car, with his hands behind his back and his head down, moving with the deflated posture of a man whose logistics company had just been audited in the most literal possible sense. Connor Muldoon came out talking, still talking, when the car door closed, the universal performance of someone attempting to explain their way out of a position that had moved past explanation. Ray Muldoon did not come out. He had been processed differently, consistent with his role and his cooperation, which Renata had anticipated. Evelyn Marsh walked off her porch at 9:47 without handcuffs and stood on her lawn with her arms crossed and watched the evidence team work through her garage with the same measured calm she had brought to everything. She was cooperating, providing information about the network's coordination structure in exchange for consideration in the task force case. The arson file was separate and it was moving. The footage of the alley at 2:17 in the morning was in evidence. Dale Pruitt, the man captured on Marge's camera, had been identified and would be charged with first-degree arson. The investigation into who had ordered the fire was ongoing, but the footage of Evelyn standing in the alley while it happened was not something a cooperation agreement in a different proceeding could touch. Renata had been clear about that, and Marge believed her. $2 million, Renata said on the noon call, and the number settled into the room with the particular weight of a figure that was too large to fully absorb. $2 million in stolen electronics and pharmaceuticals moved through 3 houses on a quiet cul-de-sac in Delwood, Ohio in 18 months. Flowing through houses Marge had walked past every day, driven past every evening, lived beside for 3 decades. The task force commander asked me to tell you something, Renata added with the slightly self-conscious affect of someone conveying a compliment they found both deserved and slightly absurd. 22 years in law enforcement. Most thorough civilian evidence package he's ever received. Marge told Renata to tell him she'd been an analyst her entire career. She just analyzed plumbing invoices instead of crime. They drove back to Sycamore Court that afternoon. Dennis took a longer route that had nothing to do with traffic, and Marge sat in the passenger seat and let him, because she understood that some approaches needed extra time. The house stood at the end of the cul-de-sac with the particular dignity of a structure that had been damaged but not defeated. The front gutted, the windows boarded, the siding above the door buckled and dark with soot, but the walls standing the roof intact over the rear 2/3, the bones of the thing Dennis had called home for 31 years, still holding their position in the earth. They went around the side through the gate with the broken latch that had started everything through the yard, where the garden bed sat undisturbed under their winter mulch, and up the back steps. The deck railing was solid under Marge's hand. The back door opened with the same swollen resistance it had always had. The wood expanded in its frame, the project Dennis had been meaning to address for years and never had. Inside cold, a faint pervasive smell of smoke that had worked its way through the structure from the front. The yellow kitchen cabinets unchanged and slightly surreal in their ordinariness. The pencil marks on the door frame Maria and Sophia measured annually from the time they could stand until the time they stopped growing a vertical record of years were exactly where she'd left them. She walked as far as the hallway and stopped. The living room beyond was transformed in the specific way that fire transformed things, not simply destroyed, but converted the forms of objects persisting in their damage, like evidence of what they'd been. The couch, the bookshelves. Dennis's recliner that he'd refused to replace for 15 years, despite her best efforts present in the sense that their matter remained absent in every sense that had mattered. She stood at the edge of it and waited for the grief to arrive with the force she'd been bracing for. And what came instead was something quieter. Not relief and not peace, but clarity, the recognition that what she was looking at was furniture and glass and painted drywall, and that the things this house had actually held were either in the back rooms untouched or had never been located in any room at all. The footage was in the cloud. The notebook was under her arm. The pencil marks on the door frame were 8 feet behind her. The roots of the hydrangeas were in the frozen ground outside, dormant and intact, and pointed toward a spring that was only months away. "It's bad," Dennis said from behind her. "It's fixable," she said. and she meant it without reservation, which was how she knew she was going to be all right. The contractor Glenn came in the first week and walked the damage with Dennis and gave a timeline that Marge reviewed with the same attention she applied to any document with numbers in it. 3 months to rebuild the front. New porch, new windows, new living room walls and floor. Framing solid. Glenn said, knocking on a support beam that the fire hadn't reached. They built things right back then. Don't see this quality anymore. Dennis told him his wife had picked the house. Glenn looked at Marge with the revised assessment of someone recalibrating on the fly, and she wrote him the deposit check without asking him to sharpen his pencil, which was the version of a compliment she gave to people who'd earned it. They lived in the back half of the house through December and into January, which was cramped and strange and occasionally almost comfortable in the way that hardship sometimes became once you stopped measuring it against the alternative. Craig Neville took a plea in December. Connor Muldoon cooperated with prosecutors for a reduction. Ray Muldoon was charged separately, arraigned, and released on his own recognizance pending trial. She saw him once collecting his mail in the week after the arraignment, moving with the careful economy of a man conserving something he was no longer sure he had enough of. He didn't look toward the Kowalski house. She didn't call out to him. There was nothing to say yet, and perhaps nothing to say ever. And she had learned over 71 years that the desire to resolve things that couldn't be resolved was a form of impatience she could afford to retire. In January, the Marsh house went dark and then went on the market. The sign appeared on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, Evelyn was gone, no goodbye, no forwarding address, just the for sale sign and the curtain still hanging in the front window. And the garden she'd maintained for 26 years, already beginning to show the signs of a property that had lost its keeper. Marge walked past it on her way to the mailbox one morning and looked at it once and kept walking. Some things didn't need a second look to stay accounted for. Dorothy Higgins from the far end of the street came by on a Thursday afternoon in late January, the way she'd been doing occasionally since the morning she'd offered soup back in November. Not with the frequency of someone performing neighborliness, but with the naturalness of someone who'd decided that proximity and decency were sufficient basis for showing up. She stayed for an hour, talked about her grandchildren, and a mystery novel she was enjoying, and the new bakery on Birch Street, whose cinnamon rolls were better than anything that had any right to exist in Ohio in January. Normal conversation. The specific, irreplaceable nourishment of talking about nothing important with someone who meant it. After she left, Dennis dried his hands on the dish towel and hung it on the hook beside the sink with the habit of a man who'd performed this exact motion in this exact kitchen 10,000 times. Not everyone was in it, he said. No, Marge agreed. Not everyone. The porch was finished in early March. Glenn's crew had built it wider, the cedar sealed, and the railing matching the original wood, the overhang deeper, and the steps broader, and at the corner nearest the street, a permanent light fixture that threw warm white illumination from dusk to dawn without exception. Marge found 2 wooden rocking chairs at a second-hand shop on Birch Street, painted a faded blue that reminded her of something she couldn't precisely name. She positioned them side by side on the new boards angled toward the street with a small table between them, sized for 2 coffee cups. The first morning, warm enough to sit outside, they carried their mugs to the porch and settled in. Dorothy was sweeping her front walk and raised a hand. A young family had moved into the Marsh house, a couple with a toddler and a dog currently engaged in a thorough and joyful excavation of the neglected front garden. The Neville house was still on the market, the way houses with histories tended to stay on the market, their past clinging to them, regardless of fresh paint. Dennis rocked slowly with his bad knees stretched out and his coffee balanced on the armrest with the casual confidence of long practice. Quiet morning, he observed. Good quiet, Marge said, and meant the distinction. He glanced at her. Are you keeping the cameras? She'd been sitting with that question for days, aware that the answer said something about who she intended to be on the other side of this. The cameras had been necessary. They had been the exact right tool for the exact right moment, and she didn't regret any of them. But the tool and the moment had both passed, and what remained was a street and a porch and a life that she intended to inhabit rather than surveil. Two, she said, back door and side gate. The rest come down. And the street view. She looked out at Sycamore Court, at the toddler shrieking with uncomplicated joy across a yard that was already becoming something new, at Dorothy sweeping with the peaceful industry of a woman, with nowhere more important to be at the bare trees and the March sky and the ordinary machinery of a neighborhood returning to itself. "I've got the porch for that," she said. Dennis understood the way he had always eventually understood her. Not immediately. Not always on the first pass, but completely once he had followed the logic all the way through. He nodded once and drank his coffee. The porch held them both without effort, wide enough, solid enough, built by someone who'd been told what it needed to be and had built it to last. Somewhere beneath the mulch in the garden beds along the front walk, root systems that had survived 31 winters and one fire were warming toward their annual reckoning with the season, pushing energy upward through the dead stems toward an obligation they had no language for and no doubt about. They would bloom in June. They had always bloomed in June. The fact of what had happened here in November would not change that, because roots don't carry the memory of the surface. They carry only the instruction to persist. "Next time we pretend to go on vacation," Dennis said, "let's actually go." She looked at him. He was watching the street with the quiet attention of a man who had decided somewhere in the past few months that watching a thing openly was its own form of standing your ground. And she recognized in his expression something she'd seen before, in harder contexts, the particular resolution of someone who had been through the fire and had come back from it knowing what they were made of. "Sarasota," she offered. "Sarasota," he confirmed. They sat on the porch in the March cold and rocked slowly and watched Sycamore Court assemble its new normal from the materials available. Not the street they had believed they knew. Not the street that had hidden $2 million of stolen goods and a network of careful practice deception behind 26 years of casseroles and birthday cards and borrowed trucks. But the street as it actually was, complicated, imperfect, capable of both the sustained cruelty of systematic betrayal and the unremarkable grace of a neighbor who showed up with soup because it seemed like the right thing to do. Margaret Kowalski had spent 34 years reading numbers which had taught her that the truth of a thing was never located in what was most visible, but in what persisted when everything else was subtracted away. The porch light came on at dusk that evening, as it would every evening from now on, and reached across the yard and onto the street with the steady, undemonstrative illumination of something that had been placed there with a specific purpose and intended to keep it. Not a warning, not a searchlight, just a light, left burning by a woman who had learned at some cost that the most effective thing you could do about darkness was to be the person who refused to let it settle.